I never believed in miracles until the day I heard Emma Chen speak her first words in 3 years. The sound of her voice, barely above a whisper saying, "Sing it again, please," changed everything I thought I knew about healing, hope, and the power of music to reach places that medicine couldn't touch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marco Rivera, and 6 months ago, I was just another invisible face mopping floors at Lincoln Elementary after hours, trying to make ends meet, while raising my 8-year-old daughter Lily on my own. I used to be a music teacher before Sofia died, before the bills piled up faster than my grief could process, before I traded my guitar for a janitor's cart, because steady paychecks mattered more than dreams when you're all your child has left in the world. But life has a way of orchestrating encounters that feel too perfect to be coincidental. The morning I first saw David Chen's black sedan pull up to the school's main entrance, I had no idea that the man stepping out in his expensive suit was about to become part of a story that would reshape everything I understood about purpose, connection, and the songs we carry in our hearts, even when we've forgotten how to sing them. Emma Chen was 7 years old, the same age Lily had been when Sofia's cancer finally won the battle we'd fought for 2 exhausting years. But where Lily had processed her mother's death by talking constantly, asking endless questions about heaven and whether mommy could still hear her prayers, Emma had chosen silence as her response to trauma. She'd lost her sight in a car accident 18 months earlier, the same accident that had taken her mother's life, and hadn't spoken a single word since the day she woke up in the hospital to a world that had gone permanently dark. Her father brought her to school every morning at exactly 7:30, long before classes started, because Lincoln Elementary had the district's only specialized program for visually impaired children. I watched them through the windows as I cleaned the main hallway, this perfectly dressed businessman walking slowly beside his small daughter, her white cane tapping a careful rhythm against the concrete as they navigated the path to the building. David Chen never looked rushed, never checked his phone during those morning walks, never showed any sign that these extra hours away from his multinational corporation were an inconvenience. His patience with Emma's careful pace was absolute, his hand always hovering near her shoulder without actually touching, ready to guide but never presuming to take control of her navigation through the world. The first time I actually interacted with Emma was on a Tuesday morning in October, when her cane got stuck in a crack in the sidewalk just as I was unlocking the main doors to start my shift. Her father was still getting something from the car, and she stood there frozen, not calling for help, not showing any frustration, just waiting with the kind of patience that broke my heart because it seemed too mature for someone so young. I approached carefully, knowing that startling a blind child could be dangerous. "Hey there," I said softly, making sure she could hear me coming. "Looks like your cane found a hiding spot it really likes. Mind if I help you get it loose?" She turned her head toward my voice, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She had her father's delicate features but her mother's gentle expression, at least in the old family photos I'd seen David carrying sometimes. Her eyes, though sightless, were bright and alert, and there was something in her stillness that reminded me of Lily when she was concentrating on a difficult puzzle, working through problems in her mind before taking action. I knelt down and gently freed the cane from the crack, then placed the handle back in her small hand. "There you go. That sidewalk's been causing trouble for everyone lately." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The maintenance crew keeps saying they'll fix it, but I think they're waiting for someone important to trip over it first. For just a moment, I thought I saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward, the ghost of a smile that vanished so quickly I might have imagined it. She adjusted her grip on the cane and continued toward the building, but something had shifted in the air between us, some tiny acknowledgement that I existed in her carefully guarded world. David jogged up a few seconds later, slightly out of breath, his usual composure cracked just enough to show the constant worry that lived beneath his professional exterior. "Emma? Everything okay?" She nodded once, a gesture so economical it could have meant anything or nothing, and he relaxed visibly. That's when he noticed me standing there, with my keys still in my hand, and I saw him really look at me for the first time, taking in my janitor's uniform and the early hour, and the fact that his daughter seemed comfortable with my presence. "Thank you," he said simply, and there was genuine gratitude in his voice that made me understand this man had learned not to take small kindnesses toward his daughter for granted. "I'm David Chen, Emma's father." "Marco Rivera," I replied, shaking his offered hand. "I work here. Maintenance and cleaning, mostly. Early mornings, late evenings, that sort of thing." We stood there for a moment in the kind of awkward pause that happens when two adults realize they've shared a brief moment of connection over a child's needs, but don't quite know how to extend it into actual conversation. Emma waited patiently between us, her face turned slightly toward the school doors as if she could sense that the building held something she needed, even if she couldn't quite reach it yet. That morning marked the beginning of what would become a routine that none of us planned but all of us needed. David started arriving a few minutes earlier each day, not because Emma required the extra time, but because those brief conversations with me seemed to be the only moments in his carefully scheduled life when he could talk about his daughter with someone who saw her as more than a problem to be solved or a tragedy to be pitied. Over the following weeks, I learned that David Chen's life revolved entirely around his daughter's silence. He'd hired the best pediatric psychiatrists in Portland, brought in specialists from Seattle and San Francisco, even flew Emma to a renowned children's hospital in Boston, where doctors had developed new techniques for helping traumatized children recover their voices. Every appointment ended the same way. Emma sitting quietly while experts discussed her case as if she weren't in the room, their clinical observations painting her as a fascinating puzzle rather than a little girl who'd lost everything that made her world make sense. David told me about these failed attempts during our morning conversations, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 18 months throwing money and desperation at a problem that seemed immune to both. He spoke about Emma's progress in mobility training, her exceptional performance in Braille literacy, her remarkable spatial memory that allowed her to navigate familiar spaces with confidence. But underneath every proud observation was the unspoken truth that his daughter had retreated so far into herself that even he couldn't reach her anymore. I understood that kind of retreat. After Sofia died, Lily had gone through a phase where she'd only speak to me in whispers, as if raising her voice might somehow make more bad things happen to the people she loved. The grief counselor had explained that children often try to control their environment by controlling themselves, creating rules and restrictions that feel like protection, even when they're actually isolation. Emma's silence wasn't defiance or stubbornness. It was her 8-year-old mind's attempt to create safety in a world that had proven itself capable of taking away everything she cherished without warning. My own relationship with silence had evolved differently. In the months after Sofia's funeral, I'd stopped playing music entirely. The guitar that had been my constant companion since high school gathered dust in the corner of our small apartment while I focused on practical things like insurance claims and job applications, and learning to braid Lily's hair without making her cry. Music felt too much like joy. And joy felt like betrayal when the person who'd shared every song with me was gone. But Emma's presence in my daily routine began stirring something I thought was permanently dormant. During my morning cleaning rounds, I found myself humming unconsciously while I worked. Old lullabies and folk songs that Sofia used to sing while she cooked dinner or folded laundry. The melodies seemed to emerge from some deep place that grief hadn't managed to touch, flowing out of me without permission or conscious intent. I noticed Emma responding to these inadvertent concerts in subtle ways. When I hummed while mopping the hallway outside her classroom, she'd position herself near the door during indoor recess, her head tilted in that particular way that meant she was listening intently to something the rest of the world was missing. When I whistled simple tunes while emptying trash cans, she'd stop whatever she was doing and turn toward the sound, her whole body going still with concentration. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned these observations during a chance encounter in the faculty lounge. She'd been working with visually impaired children for over a decade and had never seen Emma show such sustained interest in any stimulus. Most days, Emma completed her assignments with mechanical precision, participated in group activities when prompted, and navigated social interactions with polite but distant cooperation. But when music drifted into her environment, something awakened in her that Mrs. Patterson couldn't quite define, but desperately wanted to nurture. This conversation led to an unexpected invitation. David had been struggling with Emma's evening routine at home, particularly the hour before bedtime, when her anxiety seemed to peak without any identifiable trigger. She'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling with her sightless eyes, her small body rigid with tension that no amount of comfort or reassurance could ease. The pediatric sleep specialist had prescribed a mild medication, but David was reluctant to add pharmaceutical solutions to a problem that felt fundamentally emotional rather than medical. Mrs. Patterson had suggested that maybe Emma needed something different, something that spoke to whatever part of her was responding so positively to the ambient music in her school environment. She'd mentioned my background as a music teacher, my obvious connection with Emma during our brief morning interactions, and my understanding of childhood grief from personal experience. David had listened to this recommendation with the careful attention he gave to all professional advice about his daughter, but this time something in his expression suggested he was hearing possibility rather than just another expert opinion. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while I was helping Lily with her math homework at our kitchen table. David's voice was formal, but not cold, carrying the tone of a man who'd learned to approach delicate situations with extreme care. He explained Mrs. Patterson's suggestion, acknowledged the unusual nature of his request, and offered to pay me consulting fees that were more than I made in a month of janitorial work. But it wasn't the money that made me say yes, though our stretched budget certainly needed the help. It was the way he described Emma's bedtime struggles, the image of a little girl lying awake in the darkness that was both her reality and her punishment, unable to find peace even in sleep. I knew that kind of darkness intimately, had spent my own sleepless nights after Sofia's death staring at shadows that seemed full of everything I'd lost. Lily was immediately fascinated by the idea of me singing to help another little girl feel better. She'd been asking for months why I didn't play guitar anymore, why the music that used to fill our apartment had disappeared along with her mother. In her 8-year-old logic, helping Emma might also help me find my way back to the songs that used to make our home feel complete. The first evening I went to the Chen house, I felt like an imposter, carrying my guitar case up the marble steps of a mansion that could have housed 20 families like mine. David answered the door himself, dressed casually but still somehow formal, and led me through rooms that felt more like museum displays than living spaces. Everything was beautiful and expensive and perfectly arranged, but there was no warmth in the perfection, no sense that a child lived and played and made messes in these pristine spaces. Emma's bedroom was different. Here, finally, was evidence of a little girl's presence. Braille books stacked on a reading table, tactile toys arranged within easy reach, a collection of textured blankets that served both comfort and navigational purposes. The walls were painted a soft yellow that she'd never see but that somehow felt appropriate for someone who'd learned to experience the world through every sense except sight. She was sitting on her bed when we entered, wearing pajamas printed with raised dots that formed patterns she could feel with her fingertips. Her posture was perfect, hands folded in her lap, face turned toward us with polite attention but no particular interest. David introduced me as someone who might help her sleep better, his voice carrying the careful optimism of a father who'd learned not to promise miracles but couldn't stop hoping for them. I sat in the chair David had positioned beside her bed, and opened my guitar case with deliberate slowness, letting the soft sounds of clasps and hinges announce what was coming. Emma's head tilted slightly at the familiar noises, and I saw her fingers twitch almost imperceptibly, as if she wanted to reach toward the sound but had trained herself not to show such obvious interest. The guitar felt foreign in my hands after months of neglect. The calluses on my fingertips softened, the muscle memory rusty but not entirely forgotten. I started with something simple, a gentle finger-picking pattern that created melody without demanding attention, letting the music exist in the room like ambient light that didn't require acknowledgement or response. Emma's breathing changed within the first few measures. The rigid alertness in her shoulders softened, and she leaned back against her pillows with something that might have been relief. Her father watched from the doorway, his expressions cycling through hope and skepticism and wonder as his daughter displayed more relaxation than he'd seen from her in months. I played for 20 minutes that first night, moving through simple melodies that had no words and carried no emotional weight beyond their inherent beauty. When I finished, Emma was asleep, her face peaceful in a way that made David's eyes fill with tears he was too composed to let fall. He walked me to the door in silence, pressed a check into my hand that I knew I should refuse but couldn't afford to, and asked if I would come back tomorrow night. That became our routine. Every evening at 7:30, I'd arrive at the Chen mansion with my guitar, spend 30 minutes playing gentle music while Emma settled into sleep, and leave knowing I'd participated in something that felt more important than any teaching job I'd ever held. David usually watched from the doorway, sometimes stepping closer to observe his daughter's responses, occasionally asking quiet questions about the music or my technique, or whether I thought Emma was making progress. Progress was a difficult thing to measure with a child who'd built such careful walls around herself. Emma never spoke, never smiled, never gave obvious signs that the music meant anything to her beyond its practical value as a sleep aid. But small changes accumulated over the weeks. She began anticipating my arrival, positioning herself more comfortably on her bed before I even took out the guitar. Her breathing would slow immediately when the music started, as if her body recognized and welcomed the routine. Most significantly, she started sleeping through the night, without the restless movement and occasional nightmares that had plagued her since the accident. David noticed these improvements with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to find hope in incremental changes. During our brief conversations before and after each session, he began sharing more personal details about Emma's life before the accident, painting a picture of a chatty, musical little girl who'd sung constantly and begged for piano lessons and filled their house with the kind of joyful noise that he missed more than he could express. These stories made my evening visits feel heavier with responsibility and possibility. I wasn't just helping Emma sleep. I was potentially holding the key to reconnecting her with a part of herself she'd buried so deeply that even she might have forgotten it existed. The weight of that possibility was both inspiring and terrifying, especially when I considered how fragile my own relationship with music remained. But something was happening to me during those quiet evening sessions that I hadn't expected. Playing for Emma was teaching me that music didn't have to carry the weight of memory and loss that I'd assigned to it after Sofia's death. These simple melodies existed independently of my grief, offering comfort without demanding emotional payment, creating beauty without requiring me to confront everything I'd lost when the song stopped. Slowly, carefully, I began to remember why I'd become a music teacher in the first place, why I'd believed that songs could heal and connect and transform in ways that ordinary words couldn't touch. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday night in November, 6 weeks after I'd started playing for Emma. I'd been experimenting with different styles, trying to find melodies that might reach deeper than just sleep assistance, when I remembered a lullaby Sofia used to sing to Lily during her worst nightmares. It was an old Spanish song Sofia's grandmother had taught her. Simple but haunting, with words about stars watching over sleeping children and love that never disappears, even when people do. I'd avoided playing anything Sofia had sung, treating those melodies like sacred ground I wasn't ready to disturb. But something about the stormy evening and Emma's restless energy made me brave enough to try. I started with just the melody, letting my fingers find the familiar pattern while my voice stayed silent, testing whether I could handle the emotional weight of music that carried so much personal history. Emma's reaction was immediate and startling. Instead of settling back against her pillows like usual, she sat up straighter, her head tilted in that intense listening posture I'd come to recognize. Her hands, usually folded quietly in her lap, began moving slightly, as if she were conducting an invisible orchestra or trying to catch hold of something precious floating just beyond her reach. When I finished the melody, she remained perfectly still for almost a full minute, her breathing shallow and focused. Then, so quietly I almost thought I'd imagined it, she whispered, "Mama used to sing that song." The words hit me like lightning. David, who'd been standing in his usual spot by the doorway, went completely rigid, his eyes wide with shock and desperate hope. Emma had spoken. Not just sounds or syllables, but actual words. A complete sentence that revealed she'd been listening and remembering and connecting in ways none of us had realized. My hands were shaking as I set down the guitar, my own voice barely steady when I asked, "Would you like me to sing it with the words?" She nodded, a tiny movement that carried the weight of breaking an 18-month silence. I took a deep breath and began to sing, my voice rusty from years of not using it for anything more emotional than birthday songs. But the Spanish words came back to Sofia's melody, as if they'd been waiting patiently for me to be brave enough to let them out. Emma listened with absolute stillness until I reached the chorus, and then something miraculous happened. Her lips began moving silently, forming the words she remembered from before her world went dark, before her mother died, before she decided that speaking was too dangerous because words could be the last things you ever said to someone you loved. David was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter reconnect with a piece of her past that he'd thought was lost forever. But he didn't move from his position by the door, instinctively understanding that this moment was too fragile to disturb with adult excitement or expectations. When the song ended, Emma turned her face toward me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been trust mixed with desperate hope. "My mama sang that to me when the thunder was too loud," she whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. "She said the stars were hiding behind the clouds, but they were still watching to keep me safe." "That's a beautiful thing for a mama to say," I replied carefully, not wanting to break whatever spell was allowing her to speak. "Do you think she's still watching?" Emma considered this question with the seriousness of a child who'd spent months thinking about things too heavy for someone her age to carry. "Daddy says she is, but I can't see the stars anymore to know if it's true. Everything is always dark now, even when other people say it's bright outside." The honesty in her statement broke my heart and healed something in it at the same time. She wasn't just talking about physical blindness. She was describing the emotional darkness that had enveloped her life since the accident, the way trauma can make everything feel perpetually night even when the sun is shining. "You know what I think?" I said, setting my guitar aside so I could give her my full attention. "I think your mama knew that someday you might not be able to see the stars with your eyes, so she made sure that song would help you feel them in your heart instead. Every time you hear it, it's like she's reminding you that love doesn't need light to find you." David made a small sound from the doorway, something between a sob and a laugh, and Emma turned toward his voice with sudden awareness. "Daddy, are you crying?" "Happy tears, sweetheart," he managed, his voice thick with emotion he'd been holding back for months. "I'm crying because I missed hearing your voice so much, and now you're talking to us again." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the careful thought she seemed to give everything. I wasn't trying to be mean by not talking. I just felt like all my words got lost in the dark place where Mama went, and I didn't know how to find them again. "You weren't being mean," David assured her, finally moving closer to her bed, his businessman composure completely abandoned. "You were just trying to figure out how to be okay after something very hard happened, but maybe now we can help you find those words together." She nodded solemnly, then looked in my direction again. "Will you teach me the rest of Mama's song? I only remember some of the words, and I want to sing it the right way so she can hear it wherever she is now." That question opened a floodgate I hadn't even realized was there. For the next hour, we sat together in Emma's bedroom while I taught her the complete lullaby, verse by verse, helping her remember pronunciation and melody until she could sing it independently. Her voice was sweet and clear, gaining confidence with each repetition, and I could see David struggling to contain his joy at hearing his daughter not just speak but sing. But the most remarkable part wasn't Emma's return to speech. It was watching her begin to engage with the world around her in ways she'd avoided since the accident. She asked questions about the guitar, wondered if she could learn to play it, inquired whether I knew other songs her mother might have loved. Each question was tentative but genuine, as if she were testing whether it was safe to be curious again, whether wanting things was allowed when so much had already been taken away. When it was finally time for me to leave, Emma made a request that surprised all of us, including herself. "Could you come back tomorrow and bring your little girl? Daddy told me you have a daughter, and I think maybe I'd like to meet someone who understands about missing mamas." David and I exchanged glances over her head, both of us recognizing the significance of Emma voluntarily seeking connection with another child. She'd been politely tolerating her classmates in therapy groups, but this was the first time she'd actively wanted to spend time with a peer, the first sign that she might be ready to let other people into the carefully guarded space she'd created around her grief. "I think Lily would really like that," I told her honestly. "She's been wanting to meet you ever since I started coming here to play music. She thinks anyone who likes lullabies must be pretty special." Emma smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made her look like the little girl she'd been before tragedy rewrote her story. "Tell her I know lots of songs now, and maybe we can learn new ones together. I think I forgot how much I liked music, but now I remember." As I packed up my guitar and prepared for the drive home, I felt like I was carrying something precious and fragile, the beginning of healing that could grow into something beautiful if we were careful enough with it. Emma had found her voice again, but more than that, she'd found her courage to want things, to connect with people, to believe that joy might still be possible, even in a world that had proven itself capable of taking away everything she'd thought was permanent. But I also understood that this was just the beginning. Real healing would take time, patience, and the kind of consistent presence that couldn't be bought with consulting fees or scheduled like business appointments. Emma needed people who would show up not because they were paid to, but because they chose to, because her well-being mattered to them in ways that went beyond professional obligation. The next evening, I brought Lily with me to the Chen house, watching nervously as she stared wide-eyed at the imposing mansion that dwarfed our entire apartment building. She'd spent the entire day asking questions about Emma, practicing how to introduce herself to someone who couldn't see her gestures, and carefully selecting a small music box from her room that played a simple melody she thought Emma might enjoy. David greeted us at the door with a composure that seemed more fragile than usual, as if Emma's breakthrough the night before had left him emotionally raw and hopeful in equal measure. He led us upstairs to Emma's room, where she was sitting cross-legged on her bed, wearing a dress instead of pajamas, and holding herself with the careful posture of someone preparing for an important social occasion. The introduction between the girls was awkward at first, two 8-year-olds navigating the complex etiquette of meeting someone whose experience of the world was fundamentally different from anything they'd encountered before. Lily, normally chatty and confident, seemed suddenly aware of how much of her communication relied on facial expressions and gestures that Emma couldn't see. Emma, fresh from her return to speech, appeared uncertain about how much conversation was appropriate or welcome. But children have a remarkable ability to cut through adult complications and find genuine connection, and within minutes they'd discovered their shared love of stories, their mutual fascination with animals, and their common experience of having mothers who existed now only in memories and photographs that one of them would never be able to see. I set up my guitar and began playing softly while the girls talked, creating a musical backdrop that seemed to help both of them relax into the conversation. Emma showed Lily her collection of Braille books, running her fingers across the raised dots and explaining how she could read stories with her hands instead of her eyes. Lily demonstrated the music box she'd brought, letting Emma hold it and feel the tiny dancing figure that spun when the melody played. What struck me most was how naturally they adapted to each other's needs. Lily instinctively began describing things she would normally take for granted, telling Emma about the colors in the room, the way the lamp cast patterns on the wall, the expression on her father's face as he watched them interact. Emma, in turn, shared details about sound and texture and spatial awareness that opened up entirely new ways of experiencing the world. "Your dad plays guitar really pretty," Emma said, tilting her head toward the music. "It sounds like what I imagined sunlight would feel like if you could hold it in your hands." Lily considered this poetic observation with the seriousness it deserved. "My dad used to play all the time when my mom was alive. She said his music could make flowers grow faster and babies stop crying and sad people remember how to smile. But then she got sick and died, and he put his guitar away for a really long time until he started playing for you." The honesty of children discussing loss and healing was both heartbreaking and beautiful. They spoke about their mothers with matter-of-fact acceptance, mixed with lingering sadness, sharing memories and asking questions that adults would consider too sensitive or painful for such young minds to process. Emma described the last song her mother had sung to her before the accident, a silly made-up tune about a brave little mouse who wasn't afraid of cats because she knew she was actually a lion inside. Lily told Emma about the last conversation she'd had with her mother, when Sofia had made her promise to take care of Daddy, and remember that love doesn't disappear just because people can't hug you anymore. David and I listened to this exchange with the kind of awe that comes from witnessing children demonstrate wisdom that surpasses adult understanding. They weren't dwelling on their losses or competing over whose tragedy was more significant. They were simply acknowledging their shared experience and finding comfort in not being alone with their grief. As the evening progressed, something shifted in the dynamic that had been developing between David and me over the weeks of our evening routine. Instead of the formal politeness that had characterized our interactions, we began talking like parents who shared common concerns and experiences, people who understood the weight of raising children who'd been touched by loss too early in their lives. He told me about the impossible balance of running a corporation while being the sole emotional support for a traumatized child, about board meetings interrupted by emergency calls from school, about the guilt of having enough money to solve almost any problem except the one that mattered most. I shared stories about night shifts at the school, about choosing between paying for Lily's art supplies or buying groceries, about the way grief could make you forget who you used to be, until a child's laugh reminded you that joy was still possible. These conversations revealed that beneath his expensive suits and corporate success, David was simply a father doing his best in impossible circumstances, just as I was a father trying to provide stability while rebuilding a life that had been shattered by loss. Our circumstances were vastly different, but our fundamental concerns were identical: how to help our daughters heal, how to model resilience without pretending that pain didn't matter, how to create homes that felt safe enough for children to risk hoping again. The girls, meanwhile, had moved on from sharing stories to making plans. Emma wanted to learn guitar so she could play along when I visited. Lily offered to teach her how to braid friendship bracelets using textured strings that Emma could distinguish by touch. They discussed starting a club for kids who missed their mothers, where they could share memories and learn new ways to honor the people they'd lost. But it was Emma's next request that changed everything for all of us. "Mr. Marco," she said, her voice carrying the careful formality she used when making important announcements, "would it be okay if I came to visit you and Lily sometime? Daddy could drive me to your house, and maybe I could meet your neighborhood and see what it's like to live somewhere that feels like a real home instead of a museum." The question hung in the air with all its implications. Emma was asking to step outside the controlled environment her father had created to protect her, to experience life in a place where children played in small rooms, and families ate dinner around wobbly tables, and music happened spontaneously rather than by appointment. She was asking to expand her world in ways that might be messy and unpredictable and therefore potentially dangerous for someone who'd learned to navigate by routine and careful boundaries. David's immediate instinct was clearly protective. I could see him mentally cataloging all the ways my modest apartment might be unsuitable for a child with Emma's needs, all the potential hazards that didn't exist in his carefully modified home. But I could also see him recognizing that Emma's request represented exactly the kind of independent thinking and social initiative that months of therapy had failed to encourage. "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea," I said carefully, watching David's face for signs of panic or disapproval. "Lily would love to show you her room and introduce you to our neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez downstairs makes the best cookies in Portland, and she's been wanting to meet the little girl who's been helping me remember why I love music." Emma's face lit up with excitement that was immediately tempered by concern for her father's feelings. "Only if Daddy thinks it's okay. I don't want to go places that would make him worried about me being safe." David looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps seeing for the first time in months, not the fragile child who needed constant protection, but the brave little girl who was ready to start taking small risks in service of her own growth and happiness. The internal struggle was visible on his face, as he weighed his parental fears against Emma's obvious need for experiences that went beyond the careful limitations he'd constructed around her life. "I think," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that felt monumentally important, "that it would be good for you to see how other families live. Marco and Lily have been so kind to us, and maybe it's time for us to be better friends instead of just business arrangements." The phrase "business arrangements" hit me with unexpected force, making me realize how much our relationship had evolved beyond the professional consultation he'd originally requested. I'd been thinking of these evening visits as something closer to extended family obligations, the way neighbors help neighbors during difficult times. The idea that David might be struggling with similar feelings, trying to figure out how to transform a paid service into genuine friendship, made me understand that he was as lonely in his carefully controlled world as Emma had been in her self-imposed silence. "You're always welcome at our place," I told him honestly. "Both of you. Lily's been asking when she could cook dinner for new friends, and I think she'd be thrilled to show off her spaghetti and meatball skills. Fair warning, though. Our apartment is about the size of this bedroom, and everything in it has been repaired at least twice with duct tape and optimism." Emma giggled at this description, the first spontaneous laughter I'd ever heard from her, and David's expression softened with something that might have been relief. Perhaps he was as tired of perfection as his daughter was, as ready for relationships that were built on affection rather than careful transactions, as eager for the kind of simple human connection that couldn't be purchased or professionally arranged. The evening ended with concrete plans for Emma to visit us the following Saturday, with David staying for dinner so he could experience firsthand the kind of chaotic warmth that characterized life in our small apartment. Emma was visibly excited about the prospect of eating a meal that wasn't served on fine china, of sitting around a table where conversation might include interruptions and arguments, and the comfortable disorder of people who felt safe enough with each other to be imperfect. As I drove home with Lily chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to show Emma, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in all our lives. We were no longer just helping each other through individual crises. We were becoming something that looked suspiciously like a chosen family. People who'd found each other across the gaps left by loss and decided to build something new together. 6 months later, I stood in the community center auditorium watching Emma Chen perform her first piano recital since the accident. Her small fingers moved confidently across the keys, playing the lullaby that had brought her back to us, now arranged as a complex piece that showcased how far she'd come in reclaiming the musical gifts that trauma had temporarily buried. David sat in the front row, his corporate composure abandoned in favor of proud parent tears that he no longer tried to hide. Lily bounced excitedly in the seat beside him, whispering encouragement that Emma couldn't hear but somehow seemed to feel anyway. The auditorium was packed with neighbors, teachers, and families who'd come to support not just Emma's performance, but the remarkable transformation that had rippled through all our lives. The girl on stage bore little resemblance to the silent child I'd first encountered in the school hallway. Emma spoke freely now, laughed often, and had developed a confidence that came from understanding she was valued not despite her blindness, but as a complete person whose perspective enriched everyone around her. She'd started a music program at school for kids dealing with trauma, teaching them that songs could be safe places to store feelings too big for regular words. My relationship with David had evolved into something neither of us had expected when he first hired me to play bedtime music for his daughter. We'd become genuine friends, then business partners when he invested in expanding my music therapy practice, and finally something approaching family when shared dinners and weekend adventures became the rhythm that organized our weeks. The changes in my own life were equally profound. Playing for Emma had reconnected me with the healing power of music that I'd discovered as a young teacher, but had lost in the fog of grief after Sofia's death. I'd left my janitorial job to focus full-time on music therapy, working with children and families navigating their own versions of loss and recovery. Lily had blossomed under the influence of her expanded family, developing empathy and resilience that came from witnessing firsthand how people could heal from devastating circumstances. She and Emma had become inseparable, their friendship teaching both girls that support systems could be chosen as well as inherited. As Emma's performance reached its crescendo, I thought about the miracle of timing that had brought us together. A father desperate to reach his silent daughter, a child brave enough to risk speaking again, and a man who'd forgotten how to believe in music's power to heal the deepest wounds. We'd each been incomplete in different ways, carrying losses that felt permanent, until we discovered how healing could happen in community. Emma finished her piece to thunderous applause, stood to take her bow, and smiled in our direction with the radiant confidence of someone who'd learned that darkness doesn't have to mean isolation, that voices can be recovered even after they've been lost to trauma, and that the most beautiful music often emerges from the places where hearts have been broken and carefully mended. The lullaby that had been Sofia's gift to my family had become Emma's bridge back to the fine world, proving that love really doesn't disappear when people do. It just finds new ways to sing itself into existence, connecting strangers across the spaces left by loss and creating harmony from the fragments of lives that seemed irreparably shattered. In the end, we hadn't just helped Emma find her voice again. We'd discovered that healing happens best when people who understand brokenness choose to rebuild together, creating families of choice that honor what was lost while celebrating what remains possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.